Hi, so welcome, Chris and Chrissy. It's amazing to have you on the podcast, and this is going to be quite a different episode. So, Chris and Chrissy, as I've mentioned, are the founders of the World Alcohol Free Awards, and these awards have been going. It's going into the third year now, which is really exciting, and it shows how the industry is changing. So, I think we're going to have a really fun conversation here about the different drinks that were available and the choices that people have, which are very different to the choices that were around even two years ago, I would suggest. So welcome, Chris and Chrissy. And maybe for those people that might not know you, why don't you both give a brief introduction? So let's start with Chris.
Oh, hi, Dupe. Yeah, lovely to be here. Thank you for having us on. So, yeah, I'm Chris Losh. I'm a drinks writer and journalist of 25 or so years. I've edited a lot of magazines in that time. I set up a competition, a wine competition for sommeliers. And during the course of that is where I got to meet my co-director and co-founder on World Alcohol Free Awards, Chrissy.
Yes, so my background is the hospitality industry, and I was lucky enough to have a fabulous job for 18 years where I worked for a big international restaurant company, and my title was group head of wine, but I was lucky enough to be allowed to go off piste and do other things that weren't just wine, which I guess is part of the story we'll come to in a little while. But yes, and as Chris said, we met over the course of our two careers because I would have been judging or just doing interesting things around drink, and Chris was doing interesting things, and our paths crossed.
Amazing, amazing. Well, welcome both. And I'd love to hear the backstory then. It's you were about to tell it. So maybe we could go into I don't know who wants to, I don't know how it's going to work. It's always interesting having having two
Yeah.
guests on. So I'll let you sort of weave it
I'll,
between you. But let's maybe talk about how the World Alcohol Free Awards came to be, and then we can go from there.
okay, I'll start this bit for you, Dupe. It's a bit of a almost like a kind of a sort of a lightning bolt moment that sort of did come a bit out of nowhere, really. I was doing a load of presenting at the London Wine Fair, and I was talking on stage with people from across drinks world. So people from independent retailers, from supermarkets, from hospitality, and at the end of these discussions, all of which happened at separate occasions, I'd ask them, what trend are you expecting to see over the next few years? This being a large wine fair, I was expecting they'd give me wine related answers, Prosecco, Rosé, whatever. Each one of them, independently and unprompted, said that the big trend that they were expecting to see for the next 5 years was low and no. And equally, it became very obvious that within that trend, they really didn't know much about it. They knew it was coming. They knew it was definitely on the horizon, but their knowledge and their comfort in that space was very low. And I remember thinking, well, if the guys who are in charge of importing and then selling drink aren't sure what's happening in no and low, what chance have the consumers got? And I approached Chrissy afterwards and said, is there a competition dedicated to the kind of alcohol free space? And she said, not really. So we said, well, let's just set one up. Sort of like slightly bounced her into it. I think she said, yes, that'd be a great idea. And literally, I think 48 hours later, I phoned her up and I said, right, I've got a load of domain names which I've bought. Let's go and see about getting a website created.
Yeah,
And she was like,
yeah,
oh
yeah.
my God, okay. So here we go then.
Yeah, yeah, that did happen.
So you were
But
roped into it, Chrissy.
well, it wasn't hard for Chris to do that because I think actually Chris deserves a bit of credit here because amongst journalists, he was definitely one of the first to take an interest, but fairly uniquely until quite recently. He was really one of the only people writing about drinks that was interested and took it seriously, didn't see it as a poor relation, didn't see it as sort of a chore that had to be dealt with. He wanted to know, he wanted to try the drinks, he was interested. That's why we always got on, because he cares about things. From my point of view, I got interested in the whole world of non-alcoholic drinks in about 2014, which was way before the conversations you were having, I think, Chris, because in my job, I used to pay a lot of attention to how people drink in restaurants. And I noticed something, which was that people were drinking a lot less wine. And everyone I spoke to said, oh, it's because they don't want to spend the money. And I was absolutely clear that that was not the case. I was watching. People would spend the money, but they just didn't want the quantity of alcohol. So I was already really curious about it. And in the end, I managed to get my employer to back a big 2-year project where we looked at what was available all around the world, which was fairly easy because we had restaurants around the world. And we ended up developing some drinks ourselves, importing drinks, all kinds of wonderful things that happened. And when I say wonderful things, things like a lovely Japanese gentleman turned up in the reception of our office one day with an enormous suitcase and opened it, and it was full of a soda that he'd made. And he said in broken English, I couldn't find out how to export it to the UK, so I just brought it over. And so it opened up a world for me. And it was delicious, by the way. That Japanese soda was absolutely fabulous. So I was really excited by it because for me, it was always about putting something delicious in people's glass. My job was to do that at a restaurant, but what really fired me up was just that that's how it should always be. There are lovely things to drink and there should always be something lovely in your glass. Realizing that that wasn't yet the case with non-alcoholic drinks was my light bulb moment, as Chris calls it. So I'd encountered a couple of competitions that were starting to look at non-alcoholic drinks, but like the people Chris spoke to, people didn't know enough about it. They weren't ready to judge. They didn't really understand the issues around the drinks. Whereas I had come out of 3 years of focusing almost entirely on those drinks. And so I knew there was more that could be done. So Chris's offer was irresistible, really.
It's really interesting though, Chrissie, because when I was editing Imbibe magazine, I remember reporting on your, what was it called? Orchard
The
list,
orchard
garden
list,
list, orchard
yeah.
list, yeah, which you created. And it was genuinely groundbreaking at the time. I mean, there's almost a feeling might have been 5 years ahead of its time
I think it was.
because it was so incredible what you put together, what you created, and the seriousness and the craft that went into creating the alcohol-free drinks on that list was way ahead of anything else that was being talked about in that space. And I feel as though that kind of taking it seriously thing is very much at the heart of what we tried to do when we set up the competition. So I'll give you an idea. So if you say to someone, do you drink? In brackets after that sentence is alcohol. So if you like, drinking is just drinking liquid, right? It's imbibing a liquid, but it's come to mean, do you drink alcohol? And that whole attitude about the sublimation of drinks without alcohol to drinks with alcohol is where a lot of the problems came from within our attitude, I think, as a society and within the trade itself. So within restaurants, within bars, within retailers, I'd argue as well, that it's not given the weight or the kudos that it deserves. And I think when we were setting up the World Alcohol Free Awards, we were absolutely adamant that the key thing about it was that it had to take alcohol free at least as seriously and ideally more seriously in the way that the drinks were entered, flighted, judged, scored, as happens in an alcoholic competition. And I think this is where Chrissie really takes the credit for it. I think she's done that. It's taken quite a lot of work and pulled out quite a lot of hair in the process, I suspect. But it's amazing. It really does stand out, the kind of the effort that goes into categorizing and making sure those drinks are tasted and taken seriously.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I can't believe that was 10 years ago, Chrissie, when you started exploring it, because I imagine 10 years ago there wouldn't have been that many options at all.
There really were not that many options. And even with the ability to bring in some drinks from around the world, we still ended up having to create some drinks ourselves. So we worked with one producer to make, I talked about kombucha, I love kombucha, but to make not only a very beautiful kombucha, but also something called a honey jun, which is still not well known. It's kind of kombucha's aristocratic cousin, if you like. And we had those produced for us and sold those. We worked with a manufacturer to produce some drinks which were like tributes to sake. I'd done a lot of work with Japanese sake. And I've actually never really believed that the best way to have a drink without alcohol is to start with a drink that has got alcohol and remove it. So I've always been more interested in how do you create something delicious in the glass. And we made a couple of amazing drinks, actually, which really tasted like beautiful sake, or at least called it to mind. They are unfortunately out of production now, and we started a precision cold brew tea operation. And so lots of things like that. But also, I think we didn't really know where non-alcoholic drinks could go. So a category we got interested in back then, which I think has been ignored ever since, and it's time it wasn't, was tree waters. So that you'll find some birch water around and you might find some maple water, but we started looking at all sorts of things. And we worked with a family in Alaska who were sort of traveling down to where there were trees in Canada and tapping them for beautiful flavored tree water, things like that, which I think maybe they've been slightly overlooked since then, but no, we didn't know. Nobody knew then what was going to be popular. So it was really good to have that opportunity. But that's how I was so sure that more needed to be done. When Chris said, well, let's start the competition then, really the very first thought in my mind was, A, we can do it properly, and B, we can hopefully find those drinks that everyone's been ignoring.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm fascinated by tree water. I've never tasted tree water, so I'm fascinated by that. What does that taste like?
Woody, a little bit, but maple water from, so it's the sap really. And if it's from a maple tree, then obviously if you've had maple syrup, you've got a sense of the flavor of maple, but it's not sweet. It's the water that passes sort of through the tree. And birch water has a slightly more herbaceous flavor, I would say. But there are other trees. I mean, I came across someone who was doing something with acacia, but it didn't quite get off the ground. But things like that, there's so, once you move away from drinks that are copies of alcohol, then you have all these possibilities, and you always will have possibilities. The only boundaries are what you can imagine and what you can find. So a big in joke actually between Chris and I, our sort of the waffer behind the scenes in joke is how many categories we have to have every year to make the entry system work. And when we open the competition for entries, how many days it'll be before somebody emails us and says, I'm trying to enter my drink, but I can't find a category that it fits. And it was 9 days this time, wasn't it, Chris?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So did you create a category, a
Of
new
course we did.
category?
Of course we
Yeah.
did.
Which
Yes.
category was that?
I won't go into details because obviously I can't talk about specific entries,
Okay.
but it was to do with drinks that were designed to mix in a completely different way with different liquids. So watch this space, see what happens.
Interesting.
Last year we were caught out. We had one person come to us with, well, it looked like tea bags, actually. We had to brew this special drink, and someone else came to us with a powder in a sachet. But if they come to us and the drink is a drink without alcohol that's designed for adults, it's not a children's drink, it's not something to have with breakfast. If it's a proper adult drink, we'll work with it, we'll create the category.
Yeah, in fact,
Amazing.
weirdly, Dupe, one of the things that has changed a bit when we first set up the competition, we largely thought it was going to be either existing alcohol-free drinks, such as the kinds that Chrissy's just mentioned, or deliberate ones that are going head to head with an alcoholic version.
Mm.
But what's happened in this space over the last 18 months, I'm going to say, is that it's expanded. The quote unquote soft drink space has
Mm.
expanded into the adult drink space. So you get very premium juices like juice blends, which are blended and crafted almost like wines or whiskies. They're kind of beautifully put together and very carefully created. And the same with sodas, like really finely balanced, intelligent, adult flavored sodas, which we kind of didn't see coming. So we would have been probably said, no, we're not really covering juices. We're not really going to do that because they're kind of kids' drinks. But that space has changed and become more adult. And I think a lot of drinks categories appear to be trying to get into the alcohol-free adult space because they know it's growing. And I think it means we'll get a few opportunists jumping on bandwagons, but it also means that the kind of producers that Chrissy was just alluding to, who might not have really considered doing something for this space, are now seeing opportunities where they weren't there before. So we're hoping that we're going to get more really good sodas, adult sodas, crafted soft drink blends like juice blends and so on. Because I think there's some, we weren't expecting it, but I think we will get it this year, and I can't wait to see what comes in.
Brilliant. And I wanted to pick up on a couple of things. So, Chrissy, you talked about the de-alcoholized wines and preferring to actually start from scratch. What are your thoughts on that? Because obviously there are quite a number of de-alcoholized wines, and I think a lot of people think that's the way to get a closer flavor, maybe to the real thing. But what are your thoughts on that? You seem to think it was better to start from scratch.
I wouldn't say it's better, Dupe. I think
Mm.
it's one of the ways. I think there have been issues, and to some
Mm.
extent there still are, but it's really changing now. I think there have been issues where wines that were perhaps not great to start with were sent off to be de-alcoholized and sold. So the quality wasn't very good. I've come to view de-alcoholization, I mean, it's an incredibly skilled process if it's done right. And also there needs to be a lot of skill around it. So if we're just talking about wine, the skill of understanding which grape varieties will take to it successfully and which ones may suffer too much, and how ripe the grapes should be when you pick them, and what the winemaker should think about when making the wine. So there's lots and lots of elements there, and there's often an element of blending as well, which is blending is it's very widespread in the making of wine with alcohol, but it's not been thought of in quite the way that it has to be now, I think, for making de-alcoholized wines, because I think there has to be more attention to how you create a liquid that does come out and is balanced and tasty and
It's kind of
feeling.
two schools of thought on it as well, isn't there, Chrissy? So there's people
Yeah.
who will do all of the work, as you just said, in the vineyards beforehand and say, we're going to use these grapes, we're going to pick them at this style, and then we're going to make a wine in a certain style, which when we de-alcoholize, we think is going to give us a good enough finished product once it's been de-alcoholized, end of story. And then there's people who are taking that and then adding other bits in. So they're either blending in some must is quite common, so unfermented grape juice is quite common, but even other things as well. Like we've had products in the competition where they've taken, it's been a de-alcoholized wine, and they've created almost like mixtures of local botanicals, which are plants and stuff that grow in and around the vineyard, and then they get added back in to the finished product. So you get something which is based on a wine, but has had other elements added to it, like fruit flavors and spices and herbs and stuff. So it then becomes more than just a de-alcoholized wine. And that's an interesting way to go as well. I mean, there seem to be two, you're either in that camp or you're not in it. So the people I've spoken to who are purely in the we make wine and then we de-alcoholize it are quite fundamentalist about the need to not play around with it once you've de-alcoholized it. But there's other people who say, no, you know what, it's a starting point, and if we think we can make something better or different or more layered by messing around with it, then we will. And we get both of those in the competition, and we've had good examples of both, and we've had bad examples of both, and it's a really interesting space.
Yeah, I think the two approaches are starting to cross over. So 8, 9, 10 years ago, I was still to be convinced by de-alcoholized products, and I was seeing nicer drinks that were made where somebody just tried to create something without starting with alcohol. But I think what's happening now is those two approaches are coming closer together, and in some cases they're overlapping. So people are using ideas from both sides, as Chris says, to make the drinks, and I think that's great. And I think it also, I think it does mean there's more choice. And I'm sure there are people. I'm sure some of your listeners would prefer a drink to never have been alcohol, but equally there are other people who don't mind. And one other thing I think is important to say, which is there are quite a lot of traditional drinks that have either been forgotten or not thought about as being adult drinks. In the 20th century, it was very much, as Chris said, what do you drink? Usually meant, are you a wine drinker, or are you a gin and tonic person, are you a fine whiskey person, or are you beer coffee? That's what the question meant. But I think that's really changing. And it's not just changing to whether there's alcohol or not. When I say traditional drinks, I mentioned kombucha, but there are things like shrub and switchel. There are honey-based drinks, which are not just de-alcoholized mead. There are drinks made in ways that 2,000 years ago would have seemed quite normal, quite a regular way of making a product. Drinks made with verjus, which is the juice of unripe grapes. There's all sorts of things like that which are becoming mainstream, and often you don't even quite realize that's what they are. They're packaged beautifully, and they tend, I think it's a bit sad actually, particularly with things like kombucha, they tend to make them look like wine, which isn't necessary. They're their own thing, but there are all these wonderful old recipes and old concepts which are sort of being dusted off and reimagined for the world we live in now, which is great.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think people's perception of the alcohol-free world is getting better as well. So you talked about Chrissy moving away from copies of alcohol. So I think a lot of people, when they think alcohol-free drinks, they do think alcohol-free wine or alcohol-free gin or something that is a mimic. You've obviously got things like the alcohol-free beers. But to your point, as well as things like shrubs and other things, there are so many other drinks that are coming through that are completely different to anything you would taste normally. So I can think of some off the top of my head, but I'm not going to mention names. But I think from your perspective, how have you seen that change as well, where there've been adaptogenics and various things that have been created to create something completely different to what we're used to?
I think it's just great that there is not this sort of tyranny of alcohol anymore, in that I think these possibilities have always existed, but it hasn't been a time when it was feasible for people to try and produce them. And the fact that people travel a lot and people live in different countries and learn different ways of eating and drinking has really helped as well, because I think the whole drinks industry is absorbing influences that it might have ignored before. I don't know, Chris, what would you add to that? It just seems to me to be so, it's as if somebody has taken the brakes off or undone the padlock on the gate, and suddenly everyone can go through and just imagine and make whatever they can.
Yeah, I think the bit that I really like about this space is the creativity in it. So if you look at alcohol, there tends to be, most of the drinks categories are quite prescribed within rules and regulations. Like if you make whiskey, it has to be made a certain way, aged a certain amount of time, all this kind of stuff. There's latitude within the regulations. but a lot of these things are pretty much set for reasons that they've been around for hundreds of years. What I love about this space is that it doesn't really have much of that at all. So every year we get drinks which are, you know, you taste it and you go, well, I know it's in this category. I don't know how they've made it, but it's out there somewhere. And somebody has just gone in and gone, okay, I'm going to start with this and I'm going to add a bit of that. Then I'm going to do something else crazy with it. And then I'm going to bung it in a can, or Christie said, I'm going to make it into a powder, or I'm going to put it in a tea bag and you can put hot water on it and it might taste a bit like whiskey. I mean, it's just insane. And I absolutely love that because it means people can actually just come up with a crazy idea and just do it. And that is really stimulating. And last year was our second year and we saw, I would say, generally speaking, an increase in quality across most of the categories, if not all of them. And I think that's partly because people are understanding their craft better. If they're trying to do something that's fairly typical or traditional, they're understanding it. The more they do it, the better they get at it. And then I think other people are coming in and taking that as a starting point, and then they're jumping off and going in a completely different direction. And that creates some really exciting drinks and styles, which could go on to become amazing in a few years' time. You know, it could create whole new categories. It's wonderful.
Yeah, creativity seems to be key in this industry. It's really exciting to see what's coming. So let's go back. As you say, we're going into year 3 of the World Alcohol Free Awards. Just before year 1, what were your expectations and how did year 1 go? And then obviously maybe we touch on year 2 and what you're hoping for year 3.
Having done lots of judging of different types of drinks, my expectations were probably a bit naive in that I didn't really think it would be much different. So I knew there'd be more different types of drinks to taste. But I didn't realise quite what the scope of the project was going to be. And also, I suppose I had an inkling, but I didn't really realise how much we would end up supporting and guiding people through the process, whether it's producers, judges, all kinds of people, because it was an area that so few people were used to. So we still do a lot of hand holding of producers. It's really interesting with producers. Now we have big household name companies entering their products, but we also have and always have had people who've just started up. I spent a lot of time last year talking to someone who was making batches of 40 bottles of a drink on her kitchen table and going through a divorce. And she not only managed to get the drink entered, it did really well, it got golds and sort of all that kind of stuff. So you think, well, that was worth doing.
It's funny, I think when we started out, I was expecting there to be some really good drinks and a lot of really terrible drinks, partly because it's a young industry and people are finding their way and it's not easy to make it. When you don't have the preserving effect of alcohol, your chemistry's got to be pretty good to make sure that your drink doesn't turn to something very nasty in the can, bottle, whatever. And I was expecting there to be more of that. And I think the quality was overall better than I expected. Not always brilliant, but it was very rarely that we got something that was really bad. And you can still get that in plenty of alcoholic drinks competitions, right enough. So it wasn't significantly different. And then in the second year, I think the best drinks were better, definitely. The overall base level was about the same, but the best drinks were significantly better. And the really good ones had concentration of flavors and layers of flavor. So you started to get more than just a hit of something and then the drink just disappears in your palate. You started to get a bit of a journey going on. And I think when you get that, then you're into a really good space. When you can sip something and keep finding little different things going on in different parts of your palate, then that's a good sign. And we definitely got that last year that we didn't get so much in the first year. And that's where I'd hope to get more and more of that this year. That's where we want to see the growth coming.
Yeah, yeah, that's really exciting. And I'd be interested as well in terms of the number of countries that you had drinks from in the first year, second year, and the number of products. Has that changed significantly over the 2 years?
Yeah. Well, the first year we got just under 400 entries, which is not bad. I can't remember how many countries we got in the first year, actually. I
Uh,
haven't checked that one.
no, I think our tech improved a lot in the second year, and it was easier to look at those
Yeah.
statistics. In
But
the second, oh, go on, Chris.
no, sorry, go ahead, Chris. You go on, you do it.
I was going to say in the second year, we had products from 21 countries,
Mm.
which was fabulous. And we think we're going to see more countries this year. And we also went up to about 450 products entered. So that was big growth. And the signs are that growth is going strong. We've got our fingers very crossed, obviously, but at this stage,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So if people from different countries want to, how easy is it for them to do that?
Christy, do you want to do that since you're in charge of the entry process? You have to
Oh,
say,
well, well, the entry process is straightforward. They go onto our website and register and fill in the details. We ask for a lot of details, but it's all straightforward. It's all stuff that would be printed on the label or things that they would know. We realised that perhaps the only really challenging thing, if you're not based in the UK, is to send your samples to the UK because I think a small number of companies already export their products and they're used to dealing with all of that, but it's quite complex and governments around the world don't make it all that easy for people. There's always a lot of red tape. So we did a lot of work to help with that, giving people sample paperwork and telling them how they should fill it in, how to deal with customs, so on and so forth. But this year we've gone a bit further for one market, which is the USA and to some extent Canada, and we've arranged consolidating shipping. So what that means is that producers based in the USA can send their products to a shipping company in the USA, and then it gets taken care of and it all gets brought over here in one big shipment. And our hope is that that will be successful and people will find it easier and find it more affordable and it will help them enter. And we'd like to be able to do that for other countries as well. I've already had one person inquire whether we could do it for Australia. We're not quite there yet, but we would certainly hope to.
I'm sure you'll get there, absolutely.
Mm.
And so obviously we were expecting more products maybe in year three, more countries. Any other expectations of this coming year and then beyond? I mean, this is still relatively new. Are there any other competitions that have now sprung up since you started? And so what's your expectations for beyond next year?
there's no good ones, Dupe. I've got to say.
Of
Sorry,
course.
if you run an alcohol-free drinks competition, that was a joke. So I'm not gonna throw you under the bus.
No.
You know what? It's really interesting. I mean, we ask our judges every year, what are you looking forward to tasting this year? Which isn't necessarily what their favorite drinks category is. It's what they're interested in. Nearly all of them this year, astonishingly, have said they want to try the wine. And I think when we did this question 2 years ago, people were, oh, I want to try the alcohol-free spirits, I want to try the beers, I'm interested in the aperitivos.
The tea-based drinks was a
Yeah,
popular answer, wasn't it,
yeah.
in the past? Yeah.
And I get the impression that everyone is desperate to find that step up in the wine category. That I think de-alcoholization technology has improved a lot in the last 2 years, 12 months. So we should be starting to see, no pun intended, the fruits of that in the bottle. And I cannot wait to see if we can notice it, if we can get flights of particularly red wine where the judges are putting the glasses down and going, wow, that was so much better than it would have been 2 years, 12 months ago. That would be fantastic. So I'm hoping, for the sake of our judges, if not for us, that that happens, because I think that would be a real step up.
Yeah, yeah. Red wine is the question I always get asked about. It seems to be the one thing that hasn't quite landed with people. People really struggle to find a decent alcohol-free red wine. And as you say, they're getting better, but they're still not quite where they need to be. But again, I wonder if the perception needs to change as well, because similar to having drinks that aren't the normal alcohol-free drinks, everyone is expecting wine to be wine and to be exactly the same. But the fact is, alcohol-free, it will always be slightly different. And so maybe it's
Absolutely.
also setting people's expectations that, okay, when you say it's red wine, alcohol free, it might always be a bit different. But if we can get something that is very close, then that would be amazing. But red wine has seemed to have been the outlier when you look at alcohol free gins and alcohol free beers. They seem very close, and ales and other things. And even the white wine to an extent seems slightly closer. What do you think the reason is that red wines haven't
Oh, the
quite been mastered?
structure. It's the structure, isn't it? I think it's partly weight and partly
Mm,
structure. So if you get, like, if you're the most successful white wines, Chrissy, I hope you'd agree with me, are the kind of lighter aromatic styles, that kind of Sauvignon
mm,
Blanc, Riesling
Mhm.
kind of thing,
mm,
where there's no great weight, even in the alcoholic version.
mm,
And the ones which are less successful are the ones which have less aromatic character and rely more on mouthfeel. So like your Chardonnays, those kind of
mm,
things are harder to do unless you're doing sparkling. And
mm,
when you come to red wine, that mouthfeel question, they look quite often just too thin. There aren't that many light aromatic styles of red wine, and the whole situation is complicated massively by the issue of tannin. So when you're de-alcoholizing, the structure of a wine gets very altered, which is why this comes back to Chrissy's point earlier about people choosing varieties which de-alcoholize better. So typically, I think for reds, I'll let you take over here, Chrissy, but I'm guessing it's ones with slightly lower tannin and slightly softer and higher fruit weight would be my guess. Would that
Yeah,
be right?
yeah. I think that is often the case. And I think going back to Dupe's question, I think for many people, the quality that they look for in red wine is richness. We don't talk about it much, but I think traditionally white wine is served chilled, and we're looking for that refreshment. And with red wine served a little bit warmer, cool room temperature, there's this expectation that it's going to be something rich. And unfortunately, a lot of the richness does come from the alcohol. And it's harder to convey that kind of character and quality when you take alcohol out. The, some of the most successful ones I've tasted so far are the ones where some very skilled and thoughtful additions are made, which could be extracts of other fruits or even extracts of oak or of yeast or whatever. I think people are trying a lot of different things to get to that great alcohol-free red wine, and I think they're starting to have some success. So,
Yeah.
mm,
It's
so
if
yeah,
somebody could find a way of adding mouthfeel without adding sugar, that's the
mm,
key, isn't it? So, as you said, in the minute they tend to tip in a bit of grape must, and it fattens it out. It fattens out the palate. It gives it quotes
yeah,
fruit sweetness, but it also gives it sweetness as well.
yeah,
And the best ones, I think, manage to do less of that, and they're a bit drier. I wouldn't say they're necessarily dry, but they're drier, and they taste like food wines, like the sort of thing you could have with food, because they're not overtly sweet, but they still have enough texture to them that you don't feel as though it's just thin through the mid palate. And that's the challenge. I think people are sort of getting there. They're playing around with different things, aren't they, Chrissy? And
yeah,
the raw material, the way it's de-alcoholized, what you add to it afterwards, they're sort of getting there. And I think
yeah,
that with the improvements in de-alcoholization equipment that have come in over the last, as I said, year or two, could start to make significant differences. I think with the reds, like even small improvements can have a big improvement on the end product. And I'm hoping that's where we're going to be this year.
yeah.
yeah, amazing. It'd be great if we can get a really good red wine. But we'll see. We'll see. It might not be this year, but I'm sure it will be in the next year or two. So
It
it will happen.
it's coming, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
coming.
absolutely. So when you originally spoke, Chris, you talked about the fact that the trend was alcohol free was going to be the next big thing over the next 5 years. Where do you see the World Alcohol Free Awards going in the next 5 years?
Well, hopefully, well, obviously more entries I think would be great. We'd definitely like to get more from the States. I think the States there's a lot of energy out there at the moment. I get the impression that the US was maybe a year behind, for instance, the UK when it comes to creating the first wave of good alcohol-free drinks. So post Seedlip, around the time of kind of COVID, for some reason, I think a lot of people were at home in the UK and got bored and created alcohol-free drinks. And we were out the traps very early. I think the US was slightly behind. So I think their massive creative wave is still running. And I'd really like to see more of what's going on out there. There seem to be a lot of really interesting RTDs coming out of the US. They seem to be much bigger on functionals than we are in Europe. I get the impression in Europe that we're less interested in that. So I'd love to see more of those coming out. But just more countries generally. I mean, there must be some amazing stuff happening in Asia, but it seems to be quite quiet. I'm not sure that anyone's really making much noise. And I'd love to know more about what's happening. Because I mean, you talked about that Japanese gentleman earlier, Chrissie, who just
Yeah,
created this incredible soda and these amazing sake type
yeah,
drinks. I mean, how good would it be to get some of those in? That would be fantastic. I mean, how exciting
yeah,
to taste
yeah,
that kind of stuff.
yeah, it would. I think something that I really kind of hope for in the future is that people, consumers, drinkers, will become much more used to seeing the WAFA medals on the bottles and trusting that that means this is something worth drinking. Because I think what's challenging for people who want to drink without alcohol is to know what it's going to taste like. And if it's a drink that's an alcohol-free equivalent to a gin, well, you would have an expectation at least of what it would taste like. You do need to know, is this one of the good ones? And I think when it comes to some of the more unusual drinks, I think it's really tough for people to spend their money on something without being quite sure what it is. You know, what is this? What is the liquid in this bottle? And I hope that people will start to trust that if our judges have said this is really good, this gets a medal, then they're fairly safe to give it a try. And that they'll realize as well that they can quickly check it out on our website and read the judges' tasting notes very quickly and easily. And that will help people to buy ever more exciting and ever better non-alcoholic drinks. That would be my wish, and that's what I hope is going to happen.
Yeah, that would be incredible. And what do you think the impact will be on the alcoholic industry?
Oh, that's an
Well,
interesting one.
we've seen already that they're sort of scrambling to get up to speed on it a bit, I think. So they're buying brands that they think are looking positive. I think Diageo have now rolled it out to a growing number of their alcoholic brands have got alcohol-free variations. I think we'll see more of that. I think what I'd like to see them doing, which they won't, is to develop brands of their own, which they don't do. They just kind of buy stuff that's doing well. But it'd be nice to see them. I think they are taking it seriously. If you look at Guinness Zero, it's
Mm.
been a huge seller. That's probably one of the fastest growing beer brands of any description for the last 5 years, I would guess. It's been huge. And when you see that's what makes big alcohol companies sit up and take notice, it would be nice to think they're doing it for moral reasons, but I'm not sure it goes much beyond balance sheet. And I think if they think, look, if that's where the growth is, and there's precious little growth across the alcoholic space at the moment. So if you're a business looking at it from their point of view, they're going to do more of this stuff. And I think I'm going to tentatively say that's probably a good thing because I think they can make the noise around the category that normalizes it. So if everyone's seeing Guinness Zero associated with rugby competitions, if they're seeing beer brands associated with the Euros and the Olympics and so on, like the alcohol-free ones, the thinking behind it might be quite cynical, which is it's a way of associating an alcoholic brand with a sporting activity, which they wouldn't be able to do with the actual alcoholic version. But at the same time, in terms of getting people used to the idea that you can drink this stuff, anyone can drink this stuff, and there's lots of it out there, that broadly is a positive, I think. I'm kind of cautious about it because there are negatives as well. But I think most of the small producers who I know see it as just about a good thing because they've got the budget, they can expand the category, and then once they've opened the door, they come in behind them and they can carve out a little niche for themselves. And I think that's probably positive.
I think as well, if you think about brewers and winemakers and distillers, the people doing those jobs, I think they will start to think to themselves, I've got this equipment and I could use it. I've got these skills, I've got this equipment. Maybe I could do something groundbreaking. Maybe I could do something really good without alcohol. And I think that will accelerate as younger people qualify and move up the ranks to the senior positions where they're making the drinks. I think it will become normal if you're a brewer. You're going to want to be able to make a really outstanding non-alcoholic product, just like you want to make an outstanding alcoholic one. And I think it's that ability for the two to exist side by side with the people making them having the same passion and using the same level of craft and putting the same level of skill in and being as fussy about the raw ingredients that they buy and the way they create the products. I think that's going to really evolve over the next few years.
And interestingly, Chris, you mentioned that the alcoholic industry isn't growing as much.
No, none of the categories that I know are in growth. I mean, you might get small, for instance, tequila's done well, but overall spirits, I don't think are in growth. Beer isn't in growth. Wine definitely isn't in growth. So 20 years ago, if you wanted to make money, you could make a craft gin, right? It was growing crazy speed. Craft beer, the same thing. There was an energy behind them. And they're kind of well established now, but nothing, there hasn't been any new stuff. All of the growth in the drinks world at the moment is coming in alcohol free. It's coming from a much smaller base, but the figures are still pretty good. And I don't think anyone thinks it's close to being finished yet. And I feel as though that once distribution is sorted out better. So I've thought for a while that the big issue for the alcohol free world isn't creating good products, because we've seen that there's plenty of good products out there. The challenge for these guys is getting them to market. So you can sell direct to consumer, and a lot of these people do, but how do you know about them if you've never seen them? That's, I guess, where competitions like ours are quite useful, because you can find out the gold medal winners, Google them, and then you can probably buy direct. But to make the really big step change, it needs to be, the space given over to alcohol free in supermarkets probably needs to be bigger than it is. And the same on a wine list or a drinks list in a bar, restaurant, hotel. It needs to be more than just a page at the back. If you've got a 40-page wine list with 55 types of Sancerre, and then you've got 3 alcohol-free wines and a kombucha on the back page, I mean, that's selling your customers short. And I think that the gatekeepers of the trade have been too slow, or slower than they should be, in getting up to speed with this.
And what do you think the reason is? Did they just not believe, similar to what we said at the beginning, that it was actually going to be?
Well, I think for the supermarkets, it's that awkward thing, isn't it, where a space in the supermarket is at a premium. Like every line has to deliver. If something isn't delivering, you're going 1 month, it's there. Next month, if it hasn't sold, it's gone. So they're quite unsentimental about it. So there's a very definitely a feeling that the alcohol-free space is probably slightly slower than the alcoholic one, but that's partly because it's smaller and isn't attracting people in. They haven't made as much noise about it. So almost what you need is for a retailer to stand up on their hind legs and go, you know what, we're going to push this because we think our customers want it, and we're going to commit to it for whatever, a year, and we're going to give it an extra 50% of space. And they can do it if they want, because they've done it with things like removing plastic, stuff like that. If the shareholders think it's important, they're happy to swallow a lower return. So they can do it if they want to. And I think that probably needs to happen. I think in the on-trade, I think part of the problem with hospitality is that industry has been absolutely battered during COVID and since COVID. There's been huge turnovers of staff. Trying to educate people and have people stay around long enough to actually make a difference to lists and so on is really difficult. And these industries, they can't afford to have things in there that don't sell, however much we think they should be there. So if they've got hesitation about sticking on a huge alcohol-free spirits selection, then it's not going to go. I think what they should definitely do is more beer, because that does sell. Do you need 5 rubbish lagers on draft in a pub when you could have a couple of alcohol-free ones? I mean, why not? I think that should probably change, but we'll get there eventually with it. The question is, how many alcohol-free brands are still going to be around by the time we get there? There's quite a turnover of people setting things up, looking quite good, and then just running out of financial runway, and then they disappear because they just can't keep going for any longer. So I'm hoping that we're going to keep seeing really good guys, doing well and getting the listings that they deserve. That's what we hope. We're basically there to try to reward people who are doing good stuff, so that consumers can find it and drink it. And that will help to keep these guys in business, whether they get listed at a supermarket or in a hotel chain or not.
Yeah, and that was something I was going to touch upon. It does feel like there is a big turnover of some of these drinks, and good drinks as well, that just seem to suddenly have gone and disappeared. If I think about 4 and a bit years for me of testing these alcohol-free drinks since I stopped drinking. So there are a few that I really liked that they've completely disappeared. So it was interesting you raised that point. And is it purely financial, or do you think they were just ahead of the market?
I think there's a bit both. I think it always comes down to the finances in the end. But I can think of drinks, and Chris, I know you can think of drinks that we saw doing something really imaginative and doing it really well. And they were drinks we wanted to drink and enjoyed maybe 3 years ago. And they haven't survived. And the market perhaps wasn't ready for them. And there were things they did in terms of how they described themselves or what they looked like or where they were sold that in a way perhaps doomed them. I don't know. It's really sad. There's drinks I wish could be revived already. And it's such an early stage in this process. But yeah, I think it's both harder and easier now. I think it's harder because there's a lot more competition and the big companies are obviously very involved and invested in it. But I also think it's easier because if you set out as a small business to make a non-alcoholic drink now, you've got more reference points. You can see what people are drinking and how things look and how they're described. And you can enter the World Alcohol Free Awards and get a medal, and that'll give you something to talk about. Well, you say, yeah, we've had quite a few people say to us that it really helped them. The little guys, it really does help them when they win a medal, doesn't it? If they get a good medal, it's a big deal for them.
Yeah,
so
and it helps. I think sometimes helps them get an importer somewhere else because they hear about them. It gives them a thing to sell, doesn't it? I think that's exactly right, CP. There's that difficult point, isn't there, when you set something up for a small brand that you can work on it part-time for a while, kind of doing it evenings and weekends and fulfilling deliveries and going to festivals and all this kind of stuff. And eventually there comes a point where either you have to say, we stop doing everything else and that's now what we do, or you just think it's not taken off, it's not sustainable at the level it's at. And I think that quite a lot of brands get to that point, and if they don't get that kind of like halo listing or gold medal in WAFA or something that's going to really help to lift them up, then they just kind of think, well, I've put all the time and effort in, but I can't just keep doing all my spare time on it. But at the same time, it's not a full-time salary. I can't justify leaving my job to do it. And I think the States, they seem to be better at that. I think it's easier to get access to funding in the States. I see a lot more brands that just suddenly go from apparently nowhere to making vast amounts, and they're suddenly everywhere. And I think they've obviously got access to more money. I think in Europe, we're a bit more cautious and it's a bit slower. I mean, I might be wrong. That's just my impression. But I'm hoping that the small guys can keep going long enough to survive, because in many cases they're doing really good stuff and the really groundbreaking stuff as well, often, isn't it, CP?
Definitely.
That nobody else has done.
Amazing. Well, let's hope it continues to grow. Selfishly, I love trying lots of different drinks. So
Oh,
it's,
yes.
and I think anyone who's curious about discovering alcohol-free drinks, it's incredible that there is so much choice. And
Yeah.
if people want to find out more and find those gold winners and the trophy medal winners as well,
Yeah.
then head over to the WAFA site. So I always end with asking, what does thriving alcohol free mean to you? So I'd love to hear your answers to that. Maybe we start with Chrissie this time.
Okay. Well, as you know, I'm not alcohol free only. I do still drink alcohol, but although hardly any. But for me, thriving alcohol free is about having just something delicious in your glass, and it's the joy of finding that delicious drink, sharing it with friends, actually pouring it. I mean, I'm really hyped at the moment because I've got some stuff in the cupboard ready for Christmas, and I can't wait to pour some for my mum. And I think it's just brought a joy that wasn't really there before, because there's just so much more to explore. And for me, it's just been pleasure all the way.
Amazing answer. I love that.
Yeah.
Brought a joy that wasn't there before. I think that's great. Chris.
So I'm also not alcohol free. In fact, I still write about alcohol quite a bit. So I'm not alcohol free.
Hmm.
But I think the most extraordinary thing about this is the excitement. It's being part of and being able to drink, without doubt, the most exciting, creative, forward-thinking drinks category on the planet at the moment, bar none. And to me, it's that kind of creative buzz I get from seeing things that I've never tried before and seeing people doing things that I've never seen before, and producers that I've never heard of before. And that is super exciting. Whether you're moderating or going alcohol free, there's never been a better time to be into a new category like this, because there's so much energy. And what we tried 2 years ago is nothing compared to what we're going to get this year in 2025. And being part of that and having access to that for the listeners to this podcast is just wonderful. There's never been a better time to be exploring this drink space. Whether you drink or not, it's just fantastic. It's a real
Yeah.
privilege to
Yeah.
be working in it with the people who work in it, because they're almost uniformly lovely people as well. That's something we
Yeah.
haven't mentioned, which we should actually. They really, they're all trying to do the right thing and they're desperate to succeed, but they're all very kind of like humble about it as well. And I think that's lovely. So to working with great people making fantastic drinks is an
Yeah.
absolute joy.
I almost think
Fantastic.
if you want to drink drinks without alcohol in them, you almost can't not thrive at the moment. It's just such a good
Yes.
time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great to hear and really encouraging, I think, for people that are going down this route and thinking that they may be missing out. A lot of the clients that I work with, they worry about FOMO, they worry about socializing without alcohol, they
Yeah.
worry about just navigating the land when everyone says you need
Yeah.
to drink. So to have that choice is
Yeah.
fantastic.
No,
And to
this is
think
where it's
outside of
at,
the
Dupe.
box.
This
It
is where it's
is.
at. This is the category to be in at the moment. It's way more
Yeah.
exciting than any of the other ones,
Absolutely.
I can tell you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, any final words before we end?
Only if you haven't already, go to the website www.worldafawards.com, either to have a look at the winners from last year, because there's lots of good ones for you to explore. And if you want to enter, if you're a producer, please do enter and stick them in front of our judges. And I'm sure you'll all love to try them.
Yeah. And there's some nice information there if you're interested in things. There's some good articles that Chris has written because he's good at that stuff. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you ever so much for being on the podcast. This has been so much fun. And I think it's going to be a real eye opener for the person listening to realize that actually there is a whole world out there, the World Alcohol Free Awards. So definitely check out the website. And you're also on Instagram as well, aren't you? So people can head over to your Instagram page as well. And I'll put those in the show notes. But it's been an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Dupe.
Thank you, Dupe.
Well, thank you, Chrissie and Chris. I hope that inspired you to at least explore the alcohol-free drinks market. There is so much choice there, and it's growing, and it's exciting to see what will happen this year and then in the coming 3 to 5 years. Happy New Year again. Let's thrive in 2025. Bye.